Okay, good evening, brothers and sisters. Thank you for being with me again this evening. I appreciate you joining up, and I hope we'll have a good time together this afternoon as we study the Word of God. I hope not to be long. I say this every week, but sometimes things go longer than I expected. I actually had a visit to the dentist yesterday, so my mouth is a little bit tender, so I hope I won't be talking too much. I feel like I shouldn't be talking too much, but we'll see what happens. Anyway, this evening, I want to talk about, I want us to look at the topic of the three laws. And probably this is something that we have been through before, and it will be by way of review. But I believe as I continue to have discussions with people, that this is one of the areas among many others that there is need of a better understanding. There's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding. I get accused all the time of teaching certain things and believing certain things which I absolutely don't. And I realize that the root reason is that people don't understand some of these issues concerning the law and the covenants. So I just feel like we need to be talking about them more than we do. Let me just look quickly and see, make sure that everything is all right. My microphone is okay. Brother Laius, Brother Florian, thank you for being with me. Good to know that everything is good. All right, I'm going to go straight to our study for this evening. And I want to begin by talking about, by just re-emphasizing the difference between the letter and the spirit. What do we mean when we talk about the letter? And what do we mean when we talk about the spirit? Now, probably the most well-known passages in this regard are the most well-known passages, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, from verse 6 to 11, where Paul says, who also hath made us able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. In this verse, there are two things we can learn, at least two things very clearly. One is, God has made us ministers of the New Testament. If you're a Christian and you feel like God has called you to share the Christian faith, then what you can know right from the beginning is that you're a minister of the New Testament, the New Covenant. And Paul specifically tells us that this New Covenant is not of the letter, but of the Spirit. That is the identifiable, the outstanding difference between both covenants. One is of the letter, and the other is of the Spirit. Remember that the subject he's discussing is the subject of the covenants, right? We are made able ministers of the New Covenant. And he says specifically, this New Covenant is not of the letter, but it is of the Spirit. So, what exactly is he calling the letter? And what exactly is he calling the Spirit? So this is the passage which is most controversial and most discussed when we talk about letter and spirit. But there are some other places. I want us to go back to some other places in the book of Romans where Paul uses the same ideas and which make it clear what he's talking about. If we go back to Romans 7 and verse 6, Paul says in verse 6, but now we are delivered from the law. So, in some kind of way, the law kept us under some kind of bondage, imprisonment. And Paul says we are delivered from the law. And how are we delivered? That being dead wherein we were held, something that held us captive. We have been delivered from it. And so, in being delivered from this thing, we are also delivered from the law. But why? He says, so that we should serve in newness of spirit, and not in the oldness of the letter. It's interesting that he uses those two words, newness and oldness. And what it reminds me of immediately is the Old and the New Testament. But anyway, what he's really focusing on is the law. And he says, now we serve in newness of spirit. We have been delivered from the law. All right? So obviously, he's talking about the law when he says we serve in newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. He's talking about two different ways that we can relate to the law. The first way is the oldness of the letter. And the new way in which we serve is the newness of spirit. Now, the other passage I want us to go to is even more clear, and probably this will put the seal on what we really mean. We go to Romans 2 and verse 29. It says, but he is a Jew which is one inwardly. So, what do we see here? Paul is saying that the real Jew. In fact, let me read verse 28. For he is not a Jew which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Jew which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit and not in the letter. Now this verse in particular clearly shows us what Paul is talking about. When he talks about the letter, he's talking about the one who is circumcised, literally circumcised in the flesh, the one who has the foreskin of his male organ cut off, literally. This is the letter. Why is it the letter? Because it is what the written word requires. It's exactly what is specified in the law. And Paul says that is the Jew who is outward. So we can understand the letter has to do with what is outward. And he talks about circumcision outward in the flesh. He's talking about the outward requirements of the law that a person performs on the outside or through his behavior outwardly. But he is a Jew which is one inwardly. Circumcision is of the heart in the spirit. So the spirit is what happens in the heart, is what happens internally. It has to do with the principles behind that outward performance. So this passage, more than any other, defines what the Bible means when it talks about the letter and the spirit. It's really talking about two different approaches to what seems to be the same thing. One of the approaches is to go through the specific behavior required by the law outwardly. The other approach is to look at the principle behind what was specified in the law and to receive the principle in the heart rather than going through the outward performance. So when Paul says that we are delivered from the law, what he's talking about is the outward law. All right? As far as the Jews understood, as far as Paul's audience understood, the law was simply what was written. It was what was given to Moses. Paul says we are delivered from the law, and what he means is the letter of the law. Because the thing that held us is dead. That's a different thing we're not going to discuss this evening. But he says we should serve in newness of spirit. What does that mean? It means that our service comes from within, and our service is based upon what is happening inside of us, and not in the oldness of the letter, meaning how we behave is not determined by what the strict rule says. It is determined by the state of our hearts. And just to make sure that you understand that this is what it means, remember, the oldness of the letter means that you circumcise. You're actually circumcised. The male organ is actually, that foreskin is actually removed. That's the letter. It's doing exactly what the law specifies. But the spirit which Christians live by, you don't actually touch the organ at all. What you do is you look at the command itself, you look at what it really represented, and you experience, you enter into the experience that was represented by the outward form. That's what it means to say we serve in newness of spirit. So you are circumcised in heart, meaning that your heart is changed by the coming of the Holy Spirit. This is the spiritual application of that particular law. So Paul says we serve in newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. This is speaking about Well, the one we looked at previously is using circumcision as an example. This one here in Romans 7 and verse 6 is speaking about the law itself, and in this passage Paul is speaking of the Ten Commandment law. Likewise in 2 Corinthians 3 he's also talking about the Ten Commandment law. But what he says is that we serve in newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. And based on the principle that we see from looking at circumcision, what we understand is that that he's saying, in serving God, in serving God in a moral way, we don't simply look at the Ten Commandments and try to keep those rules. No, there's a greater spiritual principle involved, and that spiritual principle is the transformed nature. It's a change of heart that takes place when the Spirit of Christ comes to live within. And this change of heart produces conformity to the law in a different way. It's not because you go through the specific motions demanded by that law. It's because your heart has been changed, and so your heart desires to do the things that are good. You now begin to operate from the same basis as how God operates. God does good. God lives in harmony with his laws, not because he's subject to them, not because they demand that he behave a certain way. He's simply living his life, and his life is a life of love, where he does not hate, where he's kind to his neighbors, because it is who he is. And what God has done is take us to the same place by putting his Spirit in our hearts. So we no longer are governed by the letter of the law. That's no longer what controls our lives. So the thing about the letter of the law and the thing about the letter of any behavior is that as long as you are governed by the letter, you're not free to think. You're not free to live by the principles that are there. Okay? So if I have a servant who works for me, and I tell him you are to get up every morning at 8 o'clock and you are to put on my breakfast. One morning he knows that I'm not going out. I'm going to stay home today. And so he does not put on my breakfast. When I go to him and say, why didn't you put on my breakfast? He says, I know you're not going out. Now, if he's a servant, he does not have that right to think about what he's doing. It's his duty to do as he's instructed and not to think. That's the way of a servant. Now, when a person is under the law, that is how he lives. That is how he has to live. In the law of Moses, it says that a person was not to light a fire on the Sabbath. The Jews who are under the law are still bound by that rule. And those people who live by the letter of the law, even the Ten Commandments, they are still bound by those rules. Okay? To be bound by the letter means that you don't have the freedom to think about what you are told. You just simply do as you are told because it is the way of a servant. Now, the Apostle Paul tells us that we have been delivered from that kind of government. So, we are no longer under the letter. We no longer live by the letter. We live by the Spirit. And this is true for what we call the moral aspect of the law, as well as what we call the ceremonial aspect of the law. Whether it's talking about circumcision, or feast keeping, or offering sacrifices, or anything that they were commanded to do in those rules. We now live by the Spirit, the principles behind the thing, not the literal carrying out of those detailed patterns of behavior. Which is why, though many people find it hard to understand, which is clearly why feast keeping is obsolete, along with animal sacrifices. If you do one, you are duty bound to do the rest, because the same principle that makes you do one ties you to doing the rest. So, part of the problem is that many people, especially those who are commandment keepers, they divide up the law differently. They say you have the ceremonial aspects of the law and you have the moral aspects of the law. One of the things that feast keepers try to do very hard is that they try to make feast keeping a moral issue. You see, if you don't understand the principle of letter versus spirit, you can sneak in feast keeping as moral. You can sneak in the laws about what you can sell to your neighbor and what you can sell to strangers. You can find a way to make those moral. You can find a way to make what you eat and what you don't eat moral. It depends upon how you choose to view the thing. And that's what many people are doing. Once you understand it's not about moral versus ceremonial, all aspects of the law, it's about letter versus the spirit. So why don't we sacrifice lambs anymore? Because that is the letter. What is the spiritual application? The spiritual application is that the life of Jesus Christ has been poured out for me, and that life has been given to me. I don't need a lamb because I have the real thing. I have the spiritual reality within me. Same thing about circumcision. Same thing with feast days. Jesus Christ came and he has already fulfilled at least 4 of those feasts. Why do I need to practice the letter, the legal statement mandating how I believe at a certain time of the year, when I already have the spiritual experience? It's true of every aspect of the law. And because people don't understand this, they divide the law the wrong way. They say moral and ceremonial when the Bible does not do this. What the Bible does, it divides the law, letter versus spirit. Now, you can look at 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 6 to 11 more closely. I don't want to spend too much time on it because that's not our subject this evening. But I just wanted to touch on that first before I move on to the main idea I want to share, which is, as I said, something we're familiar with, but I think we need to go over it again, which is the question of 3 kinds of law. Now, the first idea I would like us to grasp is that there are 2 different kinds of law. 2 different kinds of law. We're talking about 3 laws, but I'm saying there are 2 different kinds of law. And it is very clear that the Apostle Paul recognizes these 2 kinds of laws, and most of his writings are based upon explaining these 2 kinds of laws. It's true that it seems that most of the other apostles don't focus on these 2 kinds of law, but Jesus does. Jesus is very clear in focusing on it. Jesus and Paul are the 2 biblical figures that are very clear in focusing on these 2 laws. And even though I'm going to use phrases to describe them, which you won't find in the Bible, but the concepts are there very clearly. I'm going to talk about natural law and judicial law. And as I said, they are both in the Bible. Jesus, first of all, let me just mention some places where he spoke about this natural law and this judicial law, just in passing. Jesus said that what is important in terms of how a person lives is not what is on the outside of the cup. It's not the washing of the outside of the cup. It is what is inside the cup. If the inside of the cup is clean. Here Jesus was talking about the principle of outward religion versus inward religion. Now, outward religion is based upon obedience to a set of rules. Inward religion is based on the cleansing of the Spirit of God. It's the letter versus the spirit. In Mark chapter 7, Jesus says, it is not what goes into a man that defiles him. But then he says, from within, out of the heart of men, there proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts. All these things come from within and defile the man. Here he tells us that you have the breaking of an outward rule. But this is not the true issue. The true issue is that something inside of the person is requiring the person to do these things, and that is the real problem. And you can find Jesus, focusing on this idea over and over. If I may explain it, I would say natural law is a principle that is built into nature. It's the way nature operates. Natural law is the most effective kind of law in the universe. If you ever want something to work and to be absolutely sure that it will work, make sure that you operate on the basis of natural law. An example of what I mean, okay? if you have somebody who likes to break the speed limit, he's always driving at 120 miles per hour or somewhere over the 80 or 70 mile speed limit. You can talk to that person. You can make rules for that person. You can put up signs that say slow. You can hide policemen behind trees along the way. It may work to some extent. But there will come the moment when there are no policemen around, like when it's raining hard. There will come the moment like when there are no the signs are there, but you just don't feel like obeying the signs. Why? Because if in your heart you really like to go fast, your desire will take control from time to time. The law that says don't go above 70 is a legal law. It was made by a governing authority, and it is imposed upon you, regardless of how you feel. Your feelings don't come into consideration or what you want. It's imposed upon you, and there's always a penalty when there's a legal law. Natural law is different. Now suppose somebody went and took your car, and governed the engine, put a restrictor in the carburetor or somewhere, so that your car cannot go above 70 miles per hour. No matter what you do, the engine just won't go beyond that speed. Now, you don't need you don't need signs that say 70, do not exceed 70. You don't need policemen. You don't need to struggle with the feelings in your own mind. The natural law, based on physics and chemistry, has compelled you to live a certain way. That's what I mean when I say natural law is the most effective kind of law in the universe. You can't change or deny natural law, because natural law is really the principles that God designed in the universe at the very beginning when He created the universe. They are built in. There are rules that operate this way, and nobody can reject them or ignore them. If you burn a piece of paper, it will become ash. If you burn certain kinds of material, you'll see smoke. You can't avoid these things. The laws are built in. If you jump from a building, you will go down. You will never go up. So, this is what we call natural law. And the word law, why is it called law? Because a law is really a principle that requires a certain kind of behavior. In the most general sense, a law is a principle that requires a certain kind of behavior. Now, you can require that behavior legally by making a rule, or you can require that behavior by imposing principles of physics or chemistry or other aspects of nature upon the person or upon the situation to force the person to always live in this way. And because it is something that requires you to behave a certain way, it is called a law. Now, this is exactly how the Apostle Paul uses the word law in the passage that I'm going to look at. In fact, he uses the word law in two ways. He speaks about natural law, and he speaks about legal law. Or maybe I should put it the other way. He first of all speaks about legal law, then he speaks about natural law. So although he does not use the phrases, it's very clear this is what he's talking about. And understanding what Paul is saying is the key to understanding how Christianity works. It's a great underlying principle to help us to know how Christianity works. I'm actually getting some rain on my side, so I hope it's not affecting you too much. But we're going to go back to the Bible and look at that passage. Actually, it's in Romans chapter 7. Let me just pause to greet Brother Manos, Brother Daniel, Sister Gloria, Brother Oliver from Ghana, Brother Raymond, Brother Lloyd, Brother Supercharger, Brother Valentin. Hey, it's nice to have you guys with me. I appreciate your company. God bless you all. So, Romans 7 is where we go. There's something else I want to touch on before we go to look at the two kinds of law. Something else we want to look at. Just something that is in Romans 7. But I'll tell you something. I don't think there's 1 in a million people who understand what Paul is actually saying in these verses I'm going to look at here now. I've done a lot of reading on the book of Romans and upon these principles, and I've never heard anybody really explain the verses in terms of what Paul is really saying, as I'm going to share it with you now, which is why I say not 1 in a million. Maybe there are some people, but I just haven't encountered them. But here's what Paul says in verse 5, Romans 7 and verse 5. For when we were in the flesh, the motions of sin which were by the law did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. If you go down to verses 8 and 9, it says something similar. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. For without the law, sin was dead. For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. Now, people who read only superficially, I'm sorry to say it, but they say that how the law works to bring forth death is that the law condemns you because you break the law. But this is not Paul's meaning at all. When you read this chapter very carefully, you discover that in this chapter, when Paul talks about sin, he is defining sin in a very specific way, and it is not the normal way that we think about sin. Normally, when you think about sin, people say sin is the transgression of the law. They think about sin in relation to how you behave, how you behave in relation to the law. But this is not how Paul is defining sin. And so you have to see Paul's definition of sin to understand what he's saying. When you go down to about verse 22, you see how Paul is defining sin. He said, now it is no more I. Now if I do that I would not, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. All right? In this chapter, Paul is not defining sin as behavior, as something you do. He's defining sin as a power that lives in us, a power living inside. Okay? A force that lives inside of us that is compelling us to do the things that we don't want to do. Look at what he says as we go down. I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members. He's saying that this sin is stronger than him, and it is forcing him to do what he doesn't want to do. When he talks about in verse 16 and 17, if then I do that which I would not, I consent unto the law that it is good. Now then it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. Again, he's identifying sin as a negative force, as a master dwelling inside that is compelling people to live a certain way. That is what sin means in this chapter. So when we go back to verse 5, Paul says, when we were in the flesh, the motions of sins, which were by the law, did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. What is he calling the motions of sin? He's saying this enemy living inside, this negative power living inside, it began to raise its head because of the law. Let's go to another verse that makes it even more clear. This is one that is so misused. Where is it? Verse 7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin but by the law. For I had not known lust except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. Now most people, almost everybody will say, you see, it is through the law that you are able to define sin. You are able to know that lusting is wrong because the law tells you thou shalt not covet. So they say, you see, the law is always there to teach you the definition of sin. If you don't have the law, you don't know how to define sin. But this is not what Paul is saying at all, at all. Sin here is not behavior. Sin here is a master that lives inside of you. It's a negative ruling power. So what is Paul saying? I would not have known sin. I would not have known that there was something inside of me that I cannot control. I would not have known this, but by the law. The law is the thing that makes him know that something is wrong. How? Because he used to live in lust. He used to do all the things that are wrong and he had no problem. One day the law came and said, thou shalt not covet. Alright, so he says, okay, I'm not going to covet. And what does he discover? He discovers now that there is a power inside of him that is stronger than the desire that he has. He wants to not covet, but the power inside of him is stronger. So the law makes him discover that there's an enemy on the inside that he needs to get rid of. It's not saying that it enables him to define sin, because there are many other definitions of sin. What it is saying is that through this rule, he comes to see that there's something inside of him that is not right. And that's what he's talking about here when he says the motions of sin were by the law. Alright? Sin was quiet, sin was dormant, sin never bothered him until he tried to go against it. Once he tried to go against sin, it began to stir up itself and to bring him under its control, and it began to bring forth fruit unto death. It made him a slave and made him know that as far as doing his own will is concerned, as far as obedience is concerned, he is nothing but a boy. So it says, but sin taking occasion by the commandment. Alright? Without the law, sin was dead. And in actual fact, it wasn't actually dead, but you could not identify that there was this problem unless there was the law. So, he's not specifying the 10 Commandments, or let me put it another way. This is not to say that the 10 Commandments is the only way you can define sin. For example, in the Garden of Eden, God used the law that says do not touch the fruit, don't take the fruit. God used that law to help Adam and Eve to see that there was something wrong with them. Or to put it another way, he used that law to make them understand. He used that law as a way of enabling them to choose which master they wanted to serve. It wasn't about the law. It was about choosing their master. Now all of us are born with this master called sin living inside, but we don't know about it unless we encounter a rule that tells us to go contrary to our will. So Paul says, I was alive without the law once. But when the commandment came, sin came to life, and I died. That's what he means. Alright, well, I spent a fair amount of time on that, and that's not what really the main point I wanted to make. But let's continue now. And we're going to go to the places where Paul talks about these 3 laws, which are actually based upon the 2 kinds of law. Like I said, 2 kinds of law, 3 laws. Okay, 3 laws based upon those 2 kinds of law. Again, they are natural law and judicial law. I remember the story. It's a fable, alright? There's a fable about a scorpion who wanted to cross the river, but of course he can't swim. So he saw a frog swimming by and he said, please, Mr. Frog, can you take me across the river? And the frog said, certainly not. And the scorpion said, why? He said, because I know what you are like. As soon as we get out in the water, you are going to sting me and I'm going to die. And the scorpion said, no, absolutely not. Why would I do this? And, I need you to help me. And he talked till eventually he persuaded the frog. He got on the frog's back The frog started carrying him across. As soon as they got to the middle of the river, the scorpion stung the frog. And as they were sinking, the frog said, "Why did you do this? You promised, and now we're both going to die." The scorpion said, "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to do it, but it's my nature." Now, it's just a fable, all right, but it illustrates the point I'm trying to make. You can't get conformity, you can't obtain morality by observing the letter of the law, by observing legal law. It works sometimes. If the punishment is harsh enough, or if the motivation is strong enough, it works sometimes. But it doesn't work all the time, because nature, natural law will always prevail. So, let's go to Romans 7, verses 8 and 9. Romans 7, verse 22, not 8 and 9. Here's what Paul says. "For I delight in the law of God after the inward man." Back in Romans 7. So when he says, "I delight in the law of God," what he's referring to here is the Ten Commandment law. All right, I delight in this law. As a matter of fact, he has told us a little earlier on down in about verse 12. "Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment is just and good." So there's no question that Paul is speaking about the Ten Commandments here. And he recognizes that it is something good. There's no problem with the Ten Commandments in his thinking. The great problem is that it is not doing what he wants. It's not doing what he needs. He says, "Was then that which is good made death unto me? God forbid. But sin, that it might appear sin, working death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceeding sinful." So the commandments reveal sin. They make sin appear in my life. They show me that there is this negative power inside of me, so that the sin that is in me becomes exposed and it becomes exceedingly sinful. It is the law that forbids me to do something that reveals my inability to do that thing. And that's exactly what Paul goes on to prove. That which I do, I allow not. What I would, that I do not. But what I hate, that do I. He's showing you that the law is not helping him. He's showing you that all the law is doing is that it exposes the sin. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. All it does is expose that he's a slave. All right, so he's really speaking here of the Ten Commandment law. He says, "For I delight in the law of God after the inward man." All right, and then he says, "I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind." So, what is this law of my mind? It's the same thing he said in verse 22. "I delight in the law of God after the inward man." So he's talking about the same law, the Ten Commandment law. Now, some people have said that because Paul says, "I delight in the law of God after the inward man," and he refers to it as the law of my mind, it means that Paul is speaking of a converted person. But I absolutely reject that idea, because what this would suggest is that the converted person is still a slave to sin. That the converted person still has the master of sin living inside of him. And that is impossible. So you say, who then is this person that Paul is talking about? What is very clear when you read the chapter from beginning, if we go back up to the top, it's very clear that Paul is speaking to a man who is under the law. The law has dominion over a man as long as he liveth. He's speaking about a man who is governed by the law, but who has not yet found Christ. He's speaking about millions, maybe billions of Christians. He's speaking about those Christians who lived in his time, who were still bound to the law. He's talking about the Jews who had not yet come to Christ. Those who are governed by the law, and by this he means the letter, those who are governed by the law, they are the ones he's talking about who is in this condition. They delight in the law of God. They like the law of God. They want to keep the law. Their mind agrees that the law is good, but they find it impossible to do what the law says. So these are the ones he's talking about when he says, I delight in the law of God after the inward man. He's talking about the people who are under the law. So you see, these are people who I would even say they are converted. All right? They are converted because their minds have turned